Hello and welcome to News Club with your host B, and I'm here today joined by Mercedes and Tom Chivers. Say hello, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
And today we are going to talk about global financial catastrophe. But don't worry, we're going to make it simple, fun, and also, give you an escape hatch that you can jump out of and kick all the other passengers behind you in the bits on the way out. And we're going to talk about Hillsborough. But let's get into it. Let's talk about global tariffs and everything like that. First and foremost, though, give us a rebel yell.
Nobody knew people didn't know what the rebel yell sounds like because it's sort of lost to history, right?
Really?
Yeah, it's one of those things. There were only like written accounts of Union soldiers being like, "Oh, it sort of sounded like a yell mixed with a holler mix," and it's like, okay, well, what did that actually sound like? So it's a thing lost to history. There you go, fact of the day for you. No one actually, other than Billy Idol, no one knows what the rebel yell sounds like.
You've lost me. You've lost me.
Yeah, rebel yell was something that the Confederate soldiers used to.
It was their battle cry.
The bad guys.
Bad guys.
It was the bad guys' battle cry. Okay, yeah. So, alrighty then, let's dive into the whirlwind of economic chaos that's been brewing lately. We're talking about the global tariff crisis and the looming financial crash. This is stuff, by the way, that I've written for myself because, trying to get your head around this is a bit of a nightmare. But I've done a lot of research. I am an economics graduate. I promise you this is actually good stuff and it will actually help you out understand what's going on here. Now, obviously the news is changing day by day, but there are some broader things that are happening that are going to affect us probably and some ways of trying to understand it. So we're going to talk you through this in 6 easy points and we're going to focus on the big picture, how it affects you and what you can do about it. Buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. Okay, so first and foremost, the big story is there going to be a recession? Hopefully, most listeners have lived through a recession. I say hopefully, sadly, we will have lived through a recession. Certainly after the economic crash of 2008, that led to, decade or more of austerity. But a recession really does mean that we'll be earning less, being able to spend less, and we're going to go through some tough times. So recession hits everyone. And that's important because in some regards, stock markets can tumble, but it not affect us. Actually, just a few weeks ago, Nvidia stock crashed because of the release of DeepSeek, the Chinese AI program, and didn't affect anyone. But it was the single biggest market value loss in recorded US history, right? But it didn't affect anyone. No one would have noticed that. And to be honest, with economic crashes in the stock market, they do tend to take time before we feel them. The financial crisis of 2017, actually, it took a long time before we really felt it really badly because of the austerity programs of the 2010s. So there can sometimes even be an 18-month, 2-year lag. In this case, I think it's going to be a lot quicker, sadly. But these are things worth noting. So recession odds, the recent moves, let's talk about what's been going on. The recent moves by President Trump slapping hefty tariffs on imports have sent shockwaves to the economy. JP Morgan has upped the ante, estimating there being a 60% chance of US recession. And, the US makes up something like 25% of the world's economy. So it will affect everyone else. And JP Morgan has said 60%. Goldman Sachs isn't far behind, raising their recession odds to 45%. The big fear is stagflation. So that's a stagnant economy and massive inflation as prices go up, but no one has any money, which is really, really bad news, right? Like imagine everything getting more expensive in the supermarket and you're getting paid less than you are now. Like that's what we're talking about. So, I've talked about when DeepSeek came onto the market, Nvidia stock plummeted nearly 17%, which is the largest single day loss in US history, but it didn't really affect us. But over the past week, there's been really significant falls in shares. And then there was a little flattening out. Everyone thought, well, maybe this is it. Maybe we'll work it all out. And this is what the investors did. And then it started to tumble further. And that's because Trump announced 104% tariffs on China. Oil prices, by the way, have gone down to below $60 a barrel. And that's interesting for two reasons. One, because the Russian economy, which is obviously at war, needs the prices to be above $60 a barrel, ideally above $80 a barrel to sustain itself. So within Russia, there could be a massive economic collapse, which is going to really impoverish ordinary people in a devastating way. But also it means that basically what people in the market are saying, people who trade and make bets on how the economy is going to go, they're saying, we think people aren't going to be producing things, so they're not going to need oil. They're not, because oil runs everything, and they're saying it's not going to be worth very much because no one's going to need it, because we're not going to make anything, because no one's going to be selling anything to anyone. So that's huge. That's, again, not unprecedented, but it's big news. So what could be the reasons for this? Trump's economic strategy, some people have been talking about it, and there is a sort of new right that actually has an economic theory that's behind this. And basically their plan is like a three-legged stool. You impose these tariffs to protect domestic industries, and the tariffs are taxes. Basically put on import taxes and say this stuff has to cost more, and that's going to give us more tax money, and it's going to make getting in stuff from outside more expensive, so we'll produce stuff within US, right? Then at the same time, they give massive tax cuts. So they give ordinary people more money in their pocket by cutting their taxes. And all of this, because of the stock market crash, devalues the dollar, makes the dollar worth less. So it makes the stuff that you're now making in the US actually cheaper to sell abroad. That's supposedly potentially the plan. At the moment, we haven't seen any tax cuts. We haven't seen any strategy to like build things. But the goal is to boost domestic manufacturing without stoking inflation. That's the stated goal. Or the potential goal is, and we can come to this later, is to sink the market, and then just all the oligarchs buy up everything at cheap, and then they own the whole American economy. And they might be doing what happened to Russia in the 90s, which is Putin came along, got his buddies, bought everything cheap, and said, now you guys all own the Russian economy, and we're going to run this together like a gang. And maybe that's what Trump's doing, because the reality is, if you look at the challenges of reshoring, i.e. bringing manufacturing back to the US, they can't build stuff like China can. It would take years to build, and huge investments in technology to build factories the size of China's. China's have factories the size of cities. They have advanced robotics and technology. They have also, China has healthcare, education, and workers' protections that the Americans don't have, as well as infrastructure like roads and trains and public transport, which means that it's not just more expensive because American workers cost more. It's more expensive because if you hire people in America, you have to invest in local municipal public transport. You have to pay for their healthcare. You have to pay for things that the American government will not cover. So it's really expensive, really difficult. I don't think anyone's going to do it. So I'm just going to pause there before I talk about anything else, and just bring in you, Chivers, on this and say, what are your takeaways just from like those elements there? Like we're talking like a potential recession, the stock market is tumbling, but everyone says, well, some people say Trump has a plan, this three-legged plan. It looks like it's going to be difficult to achieve. What's your assessment?
Yeah, I mean, as a sort of mortal man without knowledge of how all these intricate systems of global finance and economics really work, what stood out to me in a lot of this is the way people are talking about what kinds of jobs would emerge from this if Trump's plan works. And a lot of it seems to be, mostly right-wing people or sort of pro-Trump people saying, this is going to be a new renaissance of high-paid, skilled, fulfilling factory jobs, producing American goods in American factories, American jobs for American workers. And it strikes me as a real dissonance with a lot of the economic reality, not just in terms of like, okay, well, you've built your entire economy on shipping cheap, badly paid, poor-conditioned labour overseas for years to build up the kind of economic prosperity and comfort of your life in America. But now, like you were saying about the expansion of Chinese manufacturing and factories, where so much of it is really high-tech, really automated, there are the actual capacity for human roles within factories is getting smaller and smaller by the day because of automation. There's a real element here of like, even if Trump's plan comes through on a 5 to 10 year basis, it is not going to be something that's going to be a huge renaissance of employment for the average American worker. It's going to be a huge sort of, not to use it sort of blandly, but like it's going to be a lot of soulless capital, because it's just going to be factories that are producing stuff with no human intervention whatsoever. Lots of people are still going to be unemployed, and there are going to be lots of people still in unfulfilling, low-skilled, low-paying jobs, even after this Trump utopian process of tariffs and reshoring, if it pays off at all. So it's funny to see that even on the terms of this will all go brilliantly because it will bring jobs back to America and people start building stuff here again, it's like, unless you're actively de-skilling and not using technology in these new factories, it's not going to create the number of jobs that people think. And there's a similar thing here in the UK with, I mean, I know we'll probably come on to like nationalising steel in a bit, but like this idea of, well, actually the UK's response to these tariffs should be to nationalise certain key industries. But like those key industries are not going to immediately create loads of jobs. They're going to create very high-tech factories that produce goods while leaving many people still out of work. So there's these real kind of conundrums and sort of contradictions in a lot of this stuff, which I don't claim to understand. But my sense is like, what does this mean for people's jobs and livelihoods? In a fantasy, it would mean everybody works in a factory and has a lovely job and makes lots of money. In reality, the kind of jobs and factories that are being brought back are not involving human workers that much anymore.
And that would be brilliant because that will bring us to my fifth point, which is about economic nationalism. But first and foremost, Mercedes, what, if anything, do you make of all of this? Like, because it is kind of hard.
I was in Spoons and I found out. Yeah.
Cool. Highbrow economic insight here.
No, that's where a lot of people, you know, if you go into a Spoons, there's Sky News on in the corner and people will glance over it and go, oh, Trump's done something or Starmer's saying something too. That's the way a lot of people get sort of the ambient background noise of news is from the TV in the corner of a Wetherspoons.
That with the British people as a British person doing British things. That's the closest I've honestly been to being British in a long time.
No, and I respect it. What I'm saying, like, that's actually the genius of Trump's communication style. So, for instance, you know, he's been coming out with this, you know, he slapped 104% tariffs on China, right? Like, because China said, we will not back down.
And I remember the 104. I remember the screen. I remember everything. That's going to jump
And
out
what
at you.
Trump has said is, oh, you know, you don't play cards when you're only holding a pair of twos. Right? Like, he's very good at creating an analogy that everyone can understand. Like, I don't understand what 104% tariffs are. Oh, but China's got a weak hand in poker? Yeah, okay, right. But, like, what have you got from all of this? Because I think a lot of the news anchors are struggling to explain what's going on, but they like the drama.
Oh my god, no, because they said nothing in the span of like 5 minutes. Like I looked back on the screen and I was like, why is the conversation still here? I feel like the same guy, bald
They've
guy.
got to fill 24 hours of news, and there's one number in the day, that big China tariff number, and they've got to fill 24 hours talking about it.
Yeah, it's like nothing else happening in this
No,
country at all.
literally. I guess like on what Tom was saying, I don't know. My brain kind of goes to like good jobs, the kind of jobs that we want to be doing. It makes me think about the fact that we should be working less anyways and being paid better. It doesn't really make me think necessarily like, how do we deal with this situation in particular? It's more like, how would I rather live?
Nice.
What's a society I would rather live in than this?
Well, brilliantly, that's something that we'll cover in part 2 then, because I think that's exactly the kind of topic we want to talk about when we talk about blue steel, right? Like essentially Labour copying the Tory approach to steel, but what else could we do? And so, yes, you know, steel sounds boring. We're going to make it fun. And I would have to agree with you. It's probably the only person on the panel that has worked in factories for a good deal of my life. It's not fun. You
No.
know, there's been entire books written about how like not fun it is. You know, one of them was called On the Conditions of the Working Class by Engels. You know, it's notoriously not fun. Karl Marx came up with a theory of alienation based on how unpleasant it is to work in a factory, which is when you're alienated from your labor. And that means like I'm doing something where I'm just a cog in a machine. I'm doing one process repeatedly. Like I would just used to put something on a moving line repeatedly. Like that was my job. Or when I worked in Amazon, I would just fill up shelves. That's all I would do. You never get to see the beginning and end of it. You're not an artisanal person who makes a table from scratch. Do you know what I mean? So you're divorced from the thing that you're doing. So how can you have the love for it? And we've managed to create somewhat a mixed economy where there's an economist called this sort of the third industrial revolution, where we've kind of gone into a post-industrial revolution in Western economies where we get to make artisanal stuff. We get to have our Etsy store. You know, we get to make things that we fully own and we have some love for them. And that brings us back to a place where we're being a bit more human because let's remember, you work, most of your life is working. So you want to be doing something you love. I'm not entirely sure who wants to be putting a bolt on a car for 8 to 10 hours a day with 30 minutes of break over the total day, all day, 6 days a week. Like, I don't know who wants to do that. I don't know why that's the American dream. But I think what has been noticed by like Yanis Varoufakis and Politics Joe is they said what Trump is doing here is he's speaking to something that the left speak to, which is the disappearance and the destruction of the working class. And whilst he's associating it with essentially bringing back crap jobs, and we're going to talk about whether he can bring them back, but probably not through this. I think for us, we want to strengthen the working class in terms of giving ourselves good jobs and less work and more joy and something more beautiful than like, great, hey guys, everyone, you can get to go back to being essentially wage slaves in horrible working conditions, making something that you don't never really see. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be hugely appealing. As the voice of Gen Z must said, is this a kind of job that you'd like?
Nope. As someone who's never worked at a factory and has no experience of this shit, no. I guess it really depends where you're coming from, right? Like, it's not a Gen Z thing necessarily. I really think it's at that point, like, how you treat your relationship with work. And I think for a long time, I've always made a distinction, not always, but for a while, I've made a distinction between play and work. And the fact that, like, we exist in this, like, coercive relationship with the thing that keeps us alive, because we're not able to enter it fully as like someone who wants to do this thing 100%. We have to do it because, I need to eat, I need to put bread on the table, I need to pay the bills. So it's never going to be this thing that I idolize. It'll never be this thing that I love fully through and through. And I don't think it's meant to be, but it is meant to be better than like something that's going to like take my soul and crush it and put it through a plastering machine and then burn it and then disintegrate. You know what I mean? That's how I don't know anything about how a factory works. But yeah, no, I think it should at the very least be something that is balanced, where I'm able to like it just enough, but also not enough to then feel like I'm destroying something I absolutely love. So whenever I think about art, it can never be something I monetize and then like rely on as something that is the sustenance for my life. I also don't want the sustenance of my life to be something that is soul crushing completely. And I think, yeah, it's why I speak to this idea of working less as well, because it's like, if I'm able to work less and still live well, if I'm able to pursue that 4-day work week, that 3-day work week, if I could be so ambitious and still live and live well, then I have the rest of the week to do whatever the fuck I want, and that's amazing. And I think that's where our aspirations should be. And I think I would like to position myself in a way in such that that is made more viable and possible for everyone around me.
Okay, beautiful. Well, let me finish up on some economic stuff here. Let me be a titan of the world, unlike Tom Chivers, who understands nothing, like Jon Snow. Game of Thrones reference there. That's right. Cool guy. 10 years after the
I'm thinking
fact.
of the Channel 4 presenter Jon Snow, who knows lots of stuff.
There's a repeated refrain in Game of Thrones.
I've seen Game of Thrones. Don't treat me like some troglodyte of culture.
Wait, catch me up. I forgot. I've not watched it in years. Like you said, you're 10 years
Flipping
behind.
heck. Yeah, like there's a sort of budding romance where like a northerner goes to Jon Snow. You know nothing, Jon Snow. I'm not going to do a northern accent because it sounds like I'm taking the mick, and I'm not. I'm just bad at accents. So yeah, you know nothing, Tom Chivers, because some broader strategists are saying that this is the rise of economic nationalism. And certainly this is going to break the global trading system. Whether there's a global trading system that now goes around the US and maybe goes around the US and China, with the EU, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, China, South Korea, Vietnam, all sort of somehow making some sort of pact. That may happen. It may very well not happen. But some people are saying, like, look, the right know that climate change is occurring, and actually all it is about now is securing resources and hunkering down. Get Greenland, invade Canada, take control of Mexico, and tell the rest of the world to sod off. And if you're thinking about like life as if it's a game of Risk, and you've just got a world map in front of you, which I know, there's a lot of geeks on the left who love to play Civilization, and they're thinking of it like that, then it makes total sense. But in the real world, I don't think that's how it works. I don't know. Tom Chivers, do you play Civilization? Do you like...
I do. I saw you just called me a cultural troglodyte for apparently not knowing Game of Thrones, and you're referencing Risk, a board game I don't think I've ever seen anyone play except in a web browser.
What? Well, yeah, no one plays it on the board because the dice rolling takes forever. You have to play it in the web browser.
That was the fun of it.
He just read you. Accept it.
Okay, fine. Anyways, troglodyte. So you like Civilization. I mean, does this make more sense? Is Trump either like a sort of master of destiny trying to push us towards this world where we all become more self-sufficient bioregions in a collapsing ecology? Or is he, the weather vane and that's just the way the wind's blowing? Or is it something else entirely?
I'm going to preempt The Left Need to Be Cooler segment by quoting from Marxist geographer David Harvey. There is no spatial fix to the crises of capital. What he means is you can't just plonk more stuff down in your own territory to solve the fact that seeking endless growth and endless profit is like a loser's game, a mug's game. There is an element in sort of Trump's strategy of it's probably not an explicit or even implicit recognition of climate change, but it is a recognition of dwindling resources and dwindling slices of the pie going around for everybody. And there's a sense of like, Trump's thing all his life has been tariffs. And he basically, the impression you get from the last sort of week is finally, or, what has come to the surface of Trump's mad rants is like, he believes that exchange for like between willing trade partners is theft. I give you money for steel. I get steel, but now I don't have my money. You've stolen my money. What's going on? He's like how babies lack object permanence until they learn it. Like you take something away from them and it disappears out of existence. Trump doesn't have object permanence for like global trade. He sort of thinks that like, oh, if you give someone money and you get a good in return, you've lost money and not get anything back for it. And his whole reshoring or onshoring, his approach to that is like, yeah, in the broader sense of climate change, is like we've got to create our own stuff. We've got to just literally almost in sort of video game terms, I've got to create all of these new resource nodes on the American map that I can continuously exploit for my own good. And as long as I keep tapping the upgrade button on the, typing in the cheat that says give me more money while also smashing update on American resource. I don't know. It seems like so much of it is built on hypotheticals and sort of really elementary ideas of how economies function. But whether it's like tied directly to climate change, I don't know. I think it's just that sense of they view politics and economics in very zero-sum game kind of terms, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that's being said and suggested is like having sort of global tariffs, like just everyone gets screwed, right, is for Trump a way of, instead of him having to meet groups of people, which he just doesn't like, and he doesn't like groups of leaders, he's not into multilateralism, is to force single leaders to come to him on their knees begging for things, and then he can get stuff. He might just be doing that just to make himself feel good. It might make America stronger. It probably won't. It probably just line his pockets, but maybe that's really all of the motivation here, and we're all just going to have to be buffeted by this balm cakes. I mean, in fact, to call him balmy is actually a disservice to people who are a little bit odd. He's like a malignant narcissist, right? Like he's a he's a real scrote, and we're all going to have to deal with that. We've got to try and make sense of it, and that's what we're going to do in the next segment. But these are some of the things that we've got to be aware of. Now, to lead into this, in America, there's this idea that you reshore like key industries, and we're going to talk about that in relation to the UK. In the US, the government doesn't invest in stuff in the US largely. It sort of has in Elon Musk's Tesla, but it doesn't usually do that, or it does in the space program. There's a couple of key areas, I guess, in the military, but it doesn't tend to in, say, automotive car industries like China has and things like that. And so the only way that if they were to reshore stuff, they could get those factories built is if like rich people had money to do that. And he's just wiped out all their wealth on the stock market. Like they've lost all their money. So like, how are they going to like build these factories and stuff like that? It just doesn't seem a starter. So let's talk about that in relation to Britain. Let's get back to the good old Blighty. If you're a worker, join a trade union. I'm always asked, well, what can I do about it? And I've got to be straight with you. It's not that simple. It just isn't, right? You can't change the world and just have a 3-step guide. But if I can give you one piece of advice, it's join a co-op or a trade union. Why? Well, first off, it protects you. It means someone's got your back at work and they're fighting for your fair pay, for safe conditions, and your basic rights. They fight for things like nationalized services, better conditions for all of us to live in, wealthier communities, which benefits everyone. But secondly, and this bit doesn't get said enough, it means that your membership fees, they pay for full-time organizers. It's their job to fight for all of us. If working conditions get better for you, they get better for everyone. Most of us have very little time, very little money to spare. So if you're only going to do one thing, make it this. And that's better than any amount of money that you spend on charity, because they're fighting for you, they're fighting for society, and most importantly, they're democratic. You get to see where your money goes and you get to decide what it gets spent on. Without them, Britain would only be livable for the super rich. So join one. It matters more than you think. And we're back from a break. You might have seen the headlines this week. You probably haven't, because we've all been talking about Trump and he's very good at that. But you might have seen the headlines. Keir Starmer firmly ruled out nationalising the steel industry. He spoke at an event in North Wales and he said, there is no case for nationalising the steel industry. What we need is partnership with business, not a return to the past. He doubled down saying Labour's Green Prosperity Plan would provide 2.5 billion for clean steel, but made it clear nationalisation is not our plan. That's ruffled some feathers, especially amongst trade unions and campaigners who see the steel sector as vital to the UK's economic resilience and climate transition. And also, there's a lot of military bods who are saying it's key to our security. But let's not forget, the UK steel industry has been on life support for years, thousands of jobs have gone, and now we're importing more and more of the stuff. And particularly with this trade war, we may end up getting a load of Chinese steel dumped on us. So even as we talk about building big green infrastructure, the big question is, if the market can't keep this industry alive, should the state step in, right? Like, that's the way that the news people frame it. I think we can ask some like bigger questions. I like the talk of the 4-day working week. I like things like that, where, you know, and it's not just steel. Obviously, also we're talking about, there's lots of us talking about nationalizing energy, water, rail, you know, the Royal Mail, you know. So like, yeah, like, let's talk about it. Do you think, Chivers, we should nationalize British Steel? And, you know, what should that look like if we do so?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we should, and we should have all of the sort of, you know, major productive heights of the economy nationalised so that they're producing for public good rather than for private profit, right? That's the essential basis of all left-wing politics and the essential basis of any kind of alternative economic system that's going to get us out of this seemingly endless trench of decline and theft and corporate greed, etc., etc. I think particularly with steel, it's a really interesting one because where Starmer talks about green steel, I imagine what he's talking about is electric arc furnaces. So the way you make steel is you get some stuff, you stick it in a big furnace that's powered by a lot of coal, it gets very, very hot, melts the materials, and bang, you've got steel at the end of it. That's very, very carbon intensive because you're having to burn stuff to make the heat to melt the steel together. Electric arc furnaces are like, okay, well, instead of using nasty polluting coal, we'll use like 2 little electric dingles and they make a really, really hot arc of plasma that melts the steel and doesn't make any nasty pollution, or like some pollution, because that's what happens when you melt stuff, but nowhere near as much as blast furnaces. That is a very different labour process in terms of like how many people you need to deal with it and how many ongoing processes of like putting fuel in the blast furnace versus flicking a switch on an electric arc to melt steel. So like it's very important that we have steel because you need it to make stuff. And the biggest...
Yo, that's a statement I have.
Insights 101.
Yeah, the biggest use of steel in this country is like railway tracks. And it's one of the thinnest areas of the economy where actually it's kind of like an insulated system in the sense of like we make it here and it stays here. And some of it's exported for profit, but actually a lot of it is used here to make stuff. So if you want like to grow the economy in a real material productive sense, to like increase the number of people using trains and building trains and getting people employed to build the trains, you need the steel and you need the people to make the steel. But like also if you want to do it greenly, nicely, you need a lot of energy to do that because it's super, super energy intensive, more so than just sticking coal in a big furnace. So now you're talking about building wind farms and power plants, and is there enough? So it's all of these questions of like nationalising steel is not just, hooray, we've done it, we've saved the factory and kept people in work and stuck a great big union flag on it. It's like, how do you integrate that into a wider transformation of the economy that recognises that all of this stuff has got to be used in a kind of circular, productive manner? I think this is, and it's really funny that, Starmer like 2 days ago was saying categorically we've ruled out nationalising British Steel, and then like the next day Rachel Reeves just says, well, hang on, there might actually be something there. And I think what she means is like the British public will take on the debt and private financiers will get to walk off with the profits when it starts being profitable again. That's what she really means by nationalising, but like it is not, it's a quick fix in the sense of like it's something that obviously should be done for basic principles of like economics for public good, but you've got to look at it in the sense of like how much else do you have to transform to actually make it useful and productive for the economy and for people as a whole, rather than just saying hooray, we've nationalised something, on to the next business.
Yeah, we need a sort of tied up industrial strategy, right? What do we produce and how? And we could be building a green economy. We could also be building an economy where, I think to your point, Mercedes, we work less. Like there's
all this automation in China.
Yeah.
If they can do it.
But the way that automation works, even in China, is okay, you automate stuff, less people have jobs. Instead of, you see, what I would like to see, if I think when we think about nationalisation, we think about it in this kind of old way that was done up until the 1970s, from the sort of 40s to the 70s largely, which is the state owns it, decides what to do, blah, 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 and it runs it essentially like a business. But if it was a cooperative, right, like if it was mutually owned by the workers, like the workers actually owned their work, every time there was like a technological improvement and there was research, investment into research and development, and they were like, right, we can do this quicker, cheaper, we can get a machine to do this. Instead of people being told, well, you've not got a job now, fuck off. Like, we could say, cool, you now have to work 2 days less a week because we don't need you here as much. Do you know what I mean? You should be sharing in the benefits of it. Like, we invest in the technology, and then the workers as well as the public sharing the benefits of this. I never hear that really from the unions or anything. There was some talk about this. There was the I think it was called the Lucas Plan in Australia, where they like tried to come up with in the 70s, a sort of work with the environmentalists and the trade unions work together to say, like, what we need to do is create green economy together, where actually workers get to work less, because everything that we're producing, like renewable energy, means that once you've got the renewable energy set up, no one needs to work on it. Like, you maintain it, but you don't have to, it's not like other forms of energy where you constantly having to mine coal, for instance. So they were trying to say, like, let's have a transition for coal miners in the 70s so that you don't, like, coal miners, for instance, are still to this day very much for let's open more coal mines. Like, they want that to happen. And I want to support the working class, have jobs that have dignity and pay well, right? And so I get torn sometimes. I'm like, yeah, I understand why you want to open a coal mine. You want more. Jeremy Corbyn was in favor of opening more coal mines, right? Like, that's what they want, because they want jobs with dignity and meaning and pride, but also good pay. And they want to be able to people want to be able to look after each other and their families and their communities, right? And so I think something like the Lucas Plan says, yeah, we nationalize things, but we also work towards making them green in a way that protects the workers who are working in those polluting industries, and gives them dignity and respect, and quite frankly, less shit work to do. Like that, I think that's the way forward, and that's what I want to see when we're talking about discussing like nationalizing steel.
The whole conversation, I keep thinking about the chat we had about natural monopolies and the way that, and like the railway system, and that being, like you said, owned by the people that work to sustain it, as opposed to simply nationalized.
What do you mean by that then? What makes you think about there?
Because you're talking about steel and then you talk about trains, and then I'm thinking about how shit these trains are and how
Yeah.
expensive they are, and how I should not be paying this much just to go to fucking London every once in a while.
Yeah.
That's
Well, part of the cost, right, is that every part of the process is privatized. It's not just that the rail company is privatized, and both National Rail, which owns the tracks, and the train companies that are on it are privatized, and they're taking all the profit and then charging more, and they're getting taxpayer subsidies, by the way, huge taxpayer subsidies. It's not just that that's happening, it's that the steel that's produced, the carriages, they're all produced by like private companies, are all making their profit first and foremost. If a great deal of that is nationalized, right, like if the steel is, but also maybe where they make the seats, and the materials for the seats are kind of nationalized and so forth, then you don't charge profit on top. You just charge what's necessary, the cost of the thing. That's going to drive down prices across the board. It's, so I think, yeah, people miss a trick when we're talking about like nationalizing rail, which Labour are sort of doing slowly over the next few years, which is we want all these other areas. And I also think, like I said, we're missing this trick where we talk about it, where we say, yeah, the government controls these things. I don't want the government to control these natural monopolies. I don't trust the bloody government.
Me neither.
No one trusts the government, right? Like, I think like there's only one profession that's less trusted than politician, and it's journalists, which is really sad. But it's the least trusted profession in Britain is politicians. Why on earth would we give them control? I'd rather National Steel have a national board that we elect part of, and is elected partially by the workers and partially by experts in the other industries that it's related to, and that be the governance model. That's how it's controlled, like that's what I want to see, and I want to see that for all industries, and that's what I want us to be talking about. I think, Tom, that's the kind of thing you talk about with the BBC, and we're going to do a special episode, but broad, just quickly, what kind of model of nationalization do you envisage being good, for these industries like steel? Because we don't want blue steel any longer.
Yeah, I think it's got to be some kind of model across these industries that like puts first and foremost the conditions and the rights and the prosperity of the people working in these industries ahead of like whoever's going to be making the profits from it. It's funny listening to you talk about like how, you know, some of these essential natural monopoly industries or industries that are so central to public life are like owned by private companies. And actually, you know, a lot of our rail and our energy and other like major areas of our economy are already nationalized, but they're nationalized because the companies are owned by other foreign governments, right? So our energy is like, a lot of our energy is owned by EDF, which is a French national company. A lot of our train networks are owned by, I think, like Dutch and French companies as well. So there are like major sections of our economy where, you know, and this isn't meant to be a point of, you know, economic protectionism and nationalism and, oh, you know, we should own this stuff and the dirty foreigners shouldn't own it. But actually, like, if it's good enough for them, it should be good enough for us. If it's good enough that like major developed economies see it as important that, you know, these are areas of the economy and production which are always going to have levels of demand because we need steel and we need trains and we need energy, then why shouldn't they be produced on a basis of public good? And yeah, I agree that, like, you know, the kind of multi-stakeholderism approach of economic management has to come above basically expecting the government to decide this is where our particular levels of investment or interest want to go. So economic organisation in any basic sense has to have at its core, you know, the workers deciding this is what we want our conditions to be, this is what we want our productive capacity to be, and this is how we get there. And we work with the people who are buying our goods and the people who are employing us to actually come to some sort of settlement, rather than a private corporate executive or a government minister just pointing and saying, do the stuff over here, make it happen, and if you don't, I'm going to sack you. There's going to be a much sort of longer term embedded relationship between the work we need to get the economy running and the people who we are hoping and expecting to do that work.
Yeah. So if, like me, you're super pissed at Labour's blue steel position, and yes, I'm going to keep using blue steel until it sticks. That's the title of this segment. Then let's talk about how we get there. Because if we do want to bring key industries back into public hands, and by the way, we haven't even talked about water, which we have to get done ASAP. How do we make that happen? One recent win we can learn from is the buses in Greater Manchester. After years of campaigning from Better Buses Greater Manchester, we own...
Burnout. Big up Andy.
Don't big up Andy. Andy's just a politician. Big up the campaign. Look, it is great that he's taking credit for a win that comes from campaigners, because I want politicians to see that they could become more popular by doing, funnily enough, popular things. Nationalisation is insanely popular. It's like 85% of the British public, broadly speaking, between 80 and 90% on all polls, and almost all industries that are polled on, people support it. You can't get 80% of British people to agree on what to have for breakfast.
I think you can, actually.
Actually, yeah, it's actually an English breakfast.
We've actually decided.
So we've got two things we agree on, and everything else we don't agree on, right? Like, obviously, we know why they don't do this. We know that it's because they're in the hands of lobbyists, and there's a sort of revolving door. And there's lots of great reporting. Byline Times does a lot of great reporting on this, on the think tanks and the sort of web of intrigue that keeps British politicians pro privatisation and against, you know, creating national wealth and protecting national resources or people's resources that we need. We know why that happens. But anyways, Burnham got popular. He did a popular thing because it was cool, but because also campaigners from Better Buses Greater Manchester, We Own It, and, you know, lots of campaigning Mancunian citizens from trade unions and community groups got on it, and they brought buses back under public control. It's incredibly popular. It's had some great effects, both in terms of, by the way, you greening the transport fleet as well, in terms of energy as well. So it has, like, not just like it's cheaper, it's more reliable, you know, it runs better, it's more interconnected with the tram system. They're now looking at connecting it with the rail system into Lancashire, right? But Andy Burnham's talking about it. He says Northern Rail, he said, which is a private company at the moment, and it runs terribly. But if you live in, say, Blackburn or Bolton or a Lancashire town that's kind of part of Greater Manchester, some of them are part of Greater Manchester and some of them are Lancashire, you know, he said you can't be relying on these bad rail networks that run by a private company that's run it into the ground. He says it needs to be brought into public control. So he's saying, like, tie that into the municipal network. So there's two things here. One, campaigners can get it. But two, I found this really interesting research, which is the return of public ownership by the Transnational Institute, which we'll include in the newsletter. And it's a brilliant global overview of the trend of remunicipalization, which, God, they have to come up with tough words. It means bringing things under control at the city level, where public services like water, energy, and transport are being taken back into public hands. It documents over 1,400 cases in 2,400 cities across 58 countries since the year 2000. Major wins include Paris's water, Berlin's energy, and public transport in cities like Jakarta. By the way, it's a great little video documentary on Jakarta's public transport system. It's incredible what they've done. And it sort of dives into why this is happening and the failed promises of privatization, high prices, poor services, and sort of lack of control. I think actually that always gets underplayed as well. It's like if you're in a poor service area for buses, there's nothing you can do. If the buses are privately owned, what are you going to do? Write to the bus company. Whereas when they're public control, you say, look, we need better bus services here. And I've got elected representatives as the councillors that I can speak to. I can speak to the council, you know? Like, and I think all of us would like to feel like we had a bit of control over the important things in our life. And a third of British people don't drive. And in cities, that increases in number even more. Like, lots of people don't drive. So they are reliant on public transport. And I don't drive. Like, and it's the worst feeling in the world that you are dependent on something you have no control over. Like, it's just really awful. And like, I think that's one of the things that gets lost in this conversation, is that we're not just fighting for cheaper prices and a lot of very practical things. We're fighting for a sense of feeling of like control over our own lives. And I think municipalization is potentially a really great move. We're seeing a lot of stuff. If Debs was here, could talk about South Yorkshire, about like bringing food systems together with like transport systems and things like that. So I think that's a good direction of travel. Tom, have you seen any like examples that you think like are really good ways of talking about or fighting for nationalisation and bringing things into public control?
No, I think, what cuts across a lot of these different campaigns we've seen, and it's always interesting that so many of them are sort of condensed into the north, at least here in the UK, sort of condensed into the north of England, where a lot of the roots of cooperative and socialist political movements have come from, is that underlying argument of like, we have lost so much control over the basic facets of our everyday life, and not just that we've lost it, but that control has now been commercialized and privatized and turned against us in a way that it's not just we've lost control, it's something that's actively working against our own interests and holding us back in our basic capacity and liberty as human beings. So I think that's got to be so core to any argument about all sorts of left-wing transformative economics that we need to live up to this moment, is to put it in people's faces. You do not have control over major parts of your life that matter to how you get on, but you could have that control if we took these relatively straightforward but transformative steps in the economy and in media and culture and the organisation of local decision making around councils or municipal organisations. It's the only way to face up to the moment, because without that control, without that individual sense of you are a part of something and you have a power and a say within it as both an individual and as a collective part of an equal and shared whole, then people are going to continue to withdraw from democratic institutions or shared collective ideals of what it means to be a citizen in a nation, and we will be finally fully the individualized economic unit that so much of neoliberalism wishes for us to be. Those are the two paths ahead of us, is take back control for individuals and make us meaningful, liberated people with power and control over all our lives, or we'll just turn into individual atomized units who are there to extract profit from until we die.
Yeah, to be divided and ruled. Yeah, Mercedes, that's why we're talking about this today. That's why we're talking about Blue Steel. I mean, some of this seems really distant, but the first segment we were talking about like this global financial crisis that's occurring, this trade war, the buffeting winds that are going to drag us into recession and make our lives worse. And in those things, we're sort of these giants of the world of like fighting over things that we don't fully understand and we certainly have no control over. It's very easy to just be sort of disappear into like either doom scrolling and enjoying kind of the horror of it all, or try and remove ourselves from it altogether. Certainly to feel lost and disconnected from all of this. And I think what we should do on this show, and generally the movement should be doing, is actually talking about nationalisation and municipalisation non-stop. I think Gary Stevenson does a great job, and he talks about wealth taxes non-stop. And I think that's cool. I think actually if you look at the research, wealth taxes will only provide actually not a huge amount. Actually, I think we should do them on the principle of the thing, and I think we should be starting to rebalance the economy that way. But also we are depending on a national government there to do something that it really doesn't want to do, right? And I think that's a good thing, but I think we should do the same thing as him, which is I think we should bang on every episode about nationalisation and municipalisation, like taking things under control for us. Because when all of this is happening, and we're going to be doing the news now, and week in, week out, we're going to be talking about what Trump has done, what some tech oligarch has done, what some billionaire has done to us, or some other foreign nation state, let's say, or even our own nation state, right, has done to us. We need to be talking about how we take back control for ourselves, how we really take back control. And this is how it's going to be done for me, for my money. Now, do you think like that's assessment's fair, or do you think we should go Gary Economics route, or maybe another route, you know?
No, we don't need to be like Gary. But
He's great.
I keep thinking about, I didn't say he wasn't. We keep using this word control, which I think is really amusing because funnily enough, I remember when I was in Denmark and we were using the public transport there, and there would just be something running in both directions every 5 minutes. There was just this like sense of complete relief. As someone who's late to like everything, I mean, as much as you know this, you know, either I'm exactly on time or I'm late because the idea of being early is just not an option. There was genuinely such a relief that like spiritually left my body as I was realizing that actually, if I can rely on transport coming every 5 minutes, not to say that this is necessarily like applicable in every city and every place and every like locality, but that ability to just like be like, wow, it's okay if I miss this one because the next one's in 5 minutes. I don't even have to wait 10 minutes, 5 minutes. This like idea to need to control, I think, kind of leaves your body a wee bit. You're like, actually, I can chill. I can relax. This is so reliable, right? We've invested into this infrastructure that is so reliable, that is of quality, that like meets my needs and like collectively the needs of everyone else. My desire, my need to like feel I have this like utter and complete control, like it really goes.
And that's what people in London have if you can afford the tube, you know, but and to a lesser extent with the buses. But again, if you've lived anywhere else and you've done that nightmare, like sort of, I mean, I used to look at the physical bus lamppost or whatever, the bus station, and look at the times and be like, oh my God, okay, it's going to be 25 minutes and then it's 18 minutes to the one after that or whatever it is. Or now you'd be like scrolling your phone looking for when the times are and you're planning your route and you know you have to be, you know, we could do away with that, you know, day in day out worry, and I think that'd be a beautiful thing. So I think that's worth fighting for, and I think if you're interested, we'll put some links in the newsletter, but definitely if you check out nothing else, check out We Own It. We own it. They are fighting for nationalisation of all those good things we're talking about, and a bunch of things we haven't even spoken about there. Some great stuff at council level and things like that. Check them out, support them, get on their mailing list and support their campaigns. They won Better Buses Greater Manchester. They've had other wins as well. And I think if you want to be part of something that makes you feel good, like you're fighting for something that gives you control, makes the world a better place, makes things cheaper, and that you could actually win because these guys win, then check out We Own It. Right, we'll have a little break before on to part 3. Thank you.
One of the first questions you need to ask yourself when you're trying to analyze any piece of media that you come across is, why is this being written? Why is this being shown to me? And the form of bias that we're going to talk about today is one of the most common reasons. It's money. I'm back to Media Bias 101, where we don't just talk about the fact that the media is lying to you, but we talk about the many different ways that they're doing it. I'm your host, Sneakrit, and today we're going to talk about commercial bias. Literally any media publication that is for profit, the bottom line of what they publish and how they serve it to you is going to come down to their commercial interest. It's not even just with for-profit organizations. When you look at not-for-profit or like state-funded groups like the BBC, there is always an interest in keeping themselves alive, and that will shape the way that they make their content. Now, back in the old days, when we mainly had print media, there were 3 core ways for commercial bias to influence what you were publishing. And that was through advertisers. You have sales, as in actual sales of the paper itself. You would have private interests, for example, the interests of shareholders or the ownership themselves to promote certain things or push certain agendas. However, this has changed a little bit in recent times. Where individual sales of a publication used to be the key revenue driver for them, the monopolization of media, especially in the UK, has led to private interest and the interest of shareholders overtaking everything else. Something else has muscled its way in here as well, because where these 2 things used to focus on print media and what people would be buying in specific locations where a publication might be popular, all of this has now gone online. What does that mean, Sneaker? Why do we care? I'll tell you why. It's because online media does not just focus on a specific area or a specific demographic. It has the whole world to reach. And in online media, it's not just about the sales that you make, it's about the views that you get, and it's about the engagement that you see. By publications like the Daily Mail, that used to have a very clear agenda in their print publications sold in the UK, are now posting things about funny cats and gaming clips, because they're targeting a US audience. They're targeting anyone all over the world. You don't need to buy a paper to be in their commercial interests. Publications gain an online following through their access to their resources. They get more eyes on them than independent creators, and then they sell your engagement to their sponsors. So remember that when you're looking at what you consider to be free content, it's your data and it's your eyes that are the financial incentive. But hey, I'm sure they're not going to do anything weird with it, guys. We'll see you next time.
We're back from a break. So, Chivers, what on earth has been going on with Hillsborough? Because honestly, it's not been in my mind for a while, but maybe it should be. And why is that?
Yeah, it was funny in the last section where we were talking about grassroots campaigns getting national politicians like Andy Burnham to finally respond to stuff, because that was core to a lot of the Hillsborough campaign for justice. In terms of Andy Burnham turning around and being one of the few politicians to admit the widespread state and public institution failures around what happened. But unfortunately, what's happened in the last couple of days has been that just when it seemed like there was finally some daylight and justice and sort of vindication for the Hillsborough families, the Labour government have turned around and said, actually no, psych, we're taking it away from you. This has been the Hillsborough Law, which has been an attempt by the families of Hillsborough victims to add into law a duty of candour. Now, what that essentially means is that if you work for a public body, a public authority, any kind of powerful state agency, that when you're dealing with investigations or inquiries or scandals, or basically anything to do with your day-to-day job, that you should have some sort of legal duty to be honest, to tell the truth, to engage in people in good faith, to not do cover-ups, and if you are found to not be doing any of that stuff, or you are engaging in cover-ups, that there actually would be some sort of systematic penalty, criminal penalty for doing so. Under the last government, the Tories were effectively saying, we're not interested in this, we don't think this is necessary, and Labour in their manifesto said, we will finally do right by the victims of Hillsborough and all the other state scandals like Orgreave or Windrush, and introduce a Hillsborough law that would change the way that public officials interact with people who have been wronged by the failures or corruptions of cover-ups of state institutions. So, of course, despite all of this, Labour have just turned around the last few days and saying we're not really interested in doing this, which feels like yet another massive betrayal of a group of people who have been wronged at basically every turn since that horrible day in 1989, where, you know, they've just been at the front of this multifaceted scandal of institutional cover-ups, shoulder shrugging from the police, multiple different governments, official inquiries and inquests, of course the lies and defamation from the press, especially the Sun in how they treated the Hillsborough families for a very, very long time, and the city of Liverpool of the North in general, when it looked like from sort of 2016 onwards, when that last inquest came out and found that the police had completely failed and were negligent in their duties, the families had been completely screwed over by the previous inquests and the government actions, it really seemed like something was going to change. So it feels like a real slap in the face for the families that just, even when they put it in their manifesto, and I know we're rapidly discovering that a Labour manifesto isn't worth the paper it's written on, to use an overused phrase, but, you know, something that seemed quite so straightforward and simple, like a public duty in law for people working in public capacities to not lie and to not be corrupt and not do cover-ups. For that to have been sort of put on the back burner again, and for Labour to shrug and say, oh, well, we've, you know, consulted closely with people who would have been affected and we don't think it's going to work. It feels like a real slap in the face. The Hillsborough families have basically come back and said, this is an insult to us. You either have to take all of this. They're sort of saying all or nothing. You have to implement the Hillsborough Law as has been proposed by the families, or nothing will have changed and this will have all been for nothing. So we wait and see what the government does next. But in this, there is an interesting little piece of where we were talking about this idea of taking back control and collective decision making and getting ordinary people involved in the processes of deciding, what do I want my life to be? What do I want people in power to know? How do I make sure it happens? The Hillsborough families had put together this family listening day, which is a bit of a bland term for what in effect was something like a citizens' assembly or a citizens' jury or, you know, public control over decision making, where they all got together as a group of families affected by Hillsborough. They dragged politicians into the room and basically they said to them, this is what we want to happen. This has been our experience. This is, from the experience we've had over the last 30 years of dealing with the scandals and the failures that followed from Hillsborough. This is what we know. We're the experts in this. We're ordinary members of the public, but we are experts in what went wrong. And we're experts in what needs to change. And if you want, not just if you want to do right by us in a sense of justice, but if you actually want to implement effective policy to make sure none of this happens again, you should listen to us as families who have both a moral and emotional and a political and a legal case for why this needs to change. So I thought that was just something that was interesting to come out of this, was after all this grassroots campaigning and this, very righteous cause for vindication and justice, that they've actually taken this method of kind of collective decision making, because it is something that's core to the idea that if we want to live in a democratic society, we have to have a shared foundation of facts. We have to have an equal stake in taking part in decisions that affect our lives. And it's a shame that, of course, when that kind of really positive, creative, productive act of collective decision making was put together by these people who have experienced this horrible ongoing tragedy and scandal all throughout most of their lives, that Labour have just turned around and said, too bad, not interested.
Why were you drawn to this story?
In a lot of ways, many people encounter these scandals not because they were personally affected by them, but because it sort of gets linked to a wider sense of scandal and corruption and cover-up in British society. And when the phone hacking scandal came out as well, and people were pointing to the Hillsborough stories as an example of this is the way that the press and the state have worked hand in hand to fuck over ordinary people, to give a completely distorted perspective on the way that the country works and who's responsible and who's in the right, who's in the wrong. And Hillsborough was one of those cases where it really came to the fore of showing, right, the press and the government and the police are so against these ordinary people that they will just all work together to slander and defame these families who have been through this total tragedy, like this unconscionable, horrific event. And it just sort of cements this idea of these institutions are not doing this on accident. They are doing it because they are working hand in glove to protect their material status and their power over society. And in recent days, the Justice Minister has sent a letter to the Hillsborough family campaign saying, it's going to be nothing, actually. You gave me an all or nothing gambit and I'm giving you nothing. Unfortunately, because of the media complex and because of the way that politicians see their role not as decision makers but as PR influencers for brand UK government, a lot of the way that ministers interact with people affected by scandals is with photo ops or soppy sit-down meetings where they say, I'm really listening to your concerns and we'll do something about this. And then they walk away and they forget about it and they go on to the next thing. This family listening day thing where it's okay, well, the victims are in charge. They're the ones who have put this meeting together. They have summoned the government. And then the government ministers have come out of that and said, well, it was very pleasant. Thanks for the tea and biscuits. I'm going to go on to other things now. It's, a really challenging question for us, for those of us who believe in these things like citizens' assemblies, citizen juries, democratising basic decision-making powers and processes in this country is it all sounds well and good and it can have real power when the people involved in it actually have power themselves. When you rely on the government to execute that power, then you're up against the standard problems of politicians don't care, politicians don't want to do it, politicians will find reasons to not do it.
Hillsborough is a really great example of how unreactive the state is. I don't know if you remember during the Black Lives Matter protests in Britain, there was a statue that was pulled down in Bristol. People were like, well, they shouldn't have done that. They should have gone through the proper channels. People went through the proper channels for well over 2 decades on that statue. People have gone through the proper channels with the Hillsborough disaster for over 30 years. Do you know how long 30 years is? Do you know how many people, by the way, died during that period? Do you know, have you ever been in legal trouble or debt trouble and people are chasing you for week after week after week for a year or 2 years or 18 months? How much that wears on you, how much it hangs over you. When you're looking for any simple change, let alone justice, it hangs over you constantly. And the institutions we have do not react. They are purposely like Frank Kafka's The Trial. They purposely lock you into some labyrinthine sort of process that makes you feel like you're losing your mind. Right, it's absolutely appalling. And I think people haven't very rarely been on the inside of these things. So you hear numbers like 30 years and, these simple changes and having a chat with politicians. I'm surprised they didn't, physically assault them. I genuinely am. because the patience and strength and fortitude these people have, most people don't, and that's what they rely upon. At university, when I was in the student union, what the university would do is say, we sort of agree in principle, let's have a series of meetings over the next sort of 6 months to any campaign we were trying to get them to divest from weapons, for instance. And you've done the stunts and you've done the campaigning actions, and then you get into the meetings, and then they wait until the next year and there's another set of student officers, right? And that's how they never agree to anything. So people have been campaigning for divestment from weapons for about 40 years, and there's just a rotation of people, and the campaign never wins because people don't carry it through. That's what they rely upon with the people of Hillsborough. They're like, hopefully you'll just die or shut up or give up at some point, right? Like, that's what they want, because they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to do stuff. And that's why, I think when we're looking for ways to create change, we have to look towards our own bodies. We have to look towards organizations we've set up and that we control. Things like trade unions, community organizations, cooperatives. These are ours, and we genuinely control them, and we genuinely have input. And if we want change, sometimes it won't happen immediately or quickly, or sometimes it's more complex than you think, but it will happen. It's possible. We can create change within those institutions. I think creating change within the state is incredibly difficult. And I think Hillsborough is a really great example of that, because, again, these guys have not only patient, they've been patient, consistent, strong though, and incredibly persistent. Like, they have not stopped, and that's what's amazing about them. And actually, a lot of people will malign them for that. They're like, why do they keep banging on about this? It's because they're not going to give up. And that's what I hugely respect about them. But that's not what it should take to create change. We shouldn't be in a society where that is the level of effort that's required to take change. I think nothing good comes easy. I think change should be considered and should require input and challenge, because you don't then know the outcomes and you can make bad decisions too easily. But this is not the way it should be. And this is one of the greatest examples of how bad our system is. How undemocratic it is, and how much we really shouldn't be relying on the state when we're trying to create change.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I think they're incredible. I genuinely do. I really do think the Hillsborough campaign, I would lose my fucking mind. It is disgraceful in the truest sense of the word. They should be disgraced. They should all be hanging their heads in shame and publicly shamed for the way that they're treating the relatives of dead people, right, who have been maligned and attacked and abused. The way that they're treating them, and the way that they're just not listening to good common sense about what can be done to prevent things like this in the future, and what reparations can be made to those people who've been damaged by these things. It's just it boils my piss. It boils, absolutely boils my piss. So.
What's a phrase?
I'm sure it boils Tom's piss as well.
Yeah, because I think what stood out to me, I think what strikes me about the government rejecting a Hillsborough law, or basically deciding that they really want to water down any kind of Hillsborough law, is not that, the changes they were asking for were, safer standing, or the police to do better at football matches. The changes they were asking for were exactly as you were saying, that the experience of these bereaved families over 30 years has been, they've been traduced and defamed and ignored, but also they have come face to face with exactly those kind of Byzantine state structures you were talking about. They have been on the leading edge, or the bleeding edge, of being fucked over by the police, who have been corrupted in how they've dealt with this, ignored by the state, who had power to do something but decided to side with the police. And the Hillsborough law wasn't like, let's make some simple changes to make sure Hillsborough doesn't happen again. It was, let's make some simple changes to make sure that the state itself can, try at least in some way to untangle itself from these kind of corrupt institutional arrangements and relationships. The families have basically reached the point where they've said, nothing can be done to recompense us for what's happened, but we can at least have some kind of change that suggests that, when there is the next inevitable, horrific, tragic scandal, that there would be some kind of accountability within the state itself. There's the event, and then there's the scandal, right? The event is that, 97 people died as a result of a tragic human crush, or that thousands of people had their phones hacked by an industrialized scale phone hacking operation, or miners at Orgreave were, brutalized by the police. The scandal is the way that the state and the state agencies react to that. So the Hillsborough law here was not even necessarily about Hillsborough. It was about untying the state from its corrupt relationships. And, it's wishful thinking to think it was the old thing of House of Lords, abolish yourself. How are you going to get people with power to surrender their own power. And in this case, how are you going to get state agencies to give up on all of these internecine relationships which they depend on to hold on to their own power and corruption? But like the fact that it has been rejected so dismissively and brazenly and openly within 8 months of the Labour manifesto saying, yeah, we want to do this and we're going to do it, and we're going to adopt the Hillsborough Law in full. It's a continuation of the corruption. It's not so much like shrugging the shoulders. It's basically the government openly admitting we're happy for these corrupt relationships to continue because we're not going to put this law into place.
And it's a good week to bury bad news. So I'm really glad that you brought it up, because that's what they want to do. They want to walk back from anything that commits them to being better, more democratic, more accountable, serving the people. They want to walk back from all of those things as much as possible. And anything they committed to that suggests that they would serve the people, they're going to run away from as soon as possible. And they're doing it here under the cover of, we're all talking about Trump and all these other things. We have a rotten state, and we have to hold it to account. Again, we've got the Grenfell disaster. We're 7-8 years now from that point. Like, there is no justice, that there is no preventative action being taken. There could be another Grenfell Tower. There could be another, dozens or hundreds of people could be dead because of the way these things work. Every time there's a crisis, we cannot seem to address it because they close ranks and they have this particular way, this sort of chumocracy of all these chums looking after each other. And I've met a few of them, and these fucking chinless wonders are seemingly like benign, pleasant types until anything comes across their sort of frame of vision that might mean that they or any of the people they know have to change how they do things. And it's a resistance to change, but it's also specifically a resistance to ending corruption. They don't want to have to stop being corrupt. They don't, our corruption is all kind of written into our laws and in our culture, and it's all very quiet, hush, hush. And this is an example of it. And it's a real example of that they don't want to change. Well, we can't let the Hillsborough campaigners down on this one, right? Again, we have to keep pushing, and we have to, again, we'll include a link in the newsletter. Send them letters of support, send them funding. I know they won't back down. I know they're going to be going another round and another round. So we have to support them, and we have to not let this news be buried. So again, check out the newsletter, get the link, share it on your socials, share it to a couple of mates in the DMs. Just say, mate, have you heard about this? Nudge it up just so that this doesn't disappear with a whimper. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so we have covered a crisis of global proportions, loose steel, and relentless and powerful campaigning by people affected by an horrendous tragedy, corruption, and cover-up. I hope that's enough for 1 week, because we've got to go now, and I hope you have the best of weeks. Do check out the newsletter, do share, do get involved, and do, where you can, try and take action. See you next week.
Bye-bye.